In the gilded corridors of Spain's royal palaces, history remembers the splendor of kings, the glory of battles, and the grandeur of empire. Yet behind that glittering facade lies a story rarely told, a story not of triumph, but of sacrifice. It is the life of Anna of Austria, a young girl born into the mighty Habsburg dynasty, whose destiny was written before she could even speak. At 14, she was crowned a queen, at 15, she bore her first child, and by the age of 30, she was dead. Anna's tragedy was not an accident of fate. It was the inevitable result of a system that treated women as currency, as vessels for alliances, and as expendable instruments of power. She was raised not for herself, but for her dynasty. Every gesture, every prayer, every breath of her short life was carefully orchestrated to serve the ambitions of others. Her childhood was brief, her freedom non-existent, her body transformed into a battlefield where dynastic dreams collided with human fragility. This is not simply the story of one forgotten queen. It is a reflection of how empires consumed the lives of women, how duty was forced upon innocence, and how political power demanded human sacrifice. Tonight, we step into Anna's world, a world of candlelit chapels, endless ceremonies, whispered fears of the Inquisition, and the crushing weight of expectation. Hers is a voice long silenced by history, but one that still echoes across the centuries, demanding to be heard. In the gilded corridors of Spain's royal palaces, history remembers the splendor of kings, the glory of battles, and the grandeur of empire. Yet behind that glittering facade lies a story rarely told, a story not of triumph, but of sacrifice. It is the life of Anna of Austria, a young girl born into the mighty Habsburg dynasty, whose destiny was written before she could even speak. At 14, she was crowned a queen, at 15, she bore her first child, and by the age of 30, she was dead. Anna's tragedy was not an accident of fate. It was the inevitable result of a system that treated women as currency, as vessels for alliances, and as expendable instruments of power. She was raised not for herself, but for her dynasty. Every gesture, every prayer, every breath of her short life was carefully orchestrated to serve the ambitions of others. Her childhood was brief, her freedom non-existent, her body transformed into a battlefield where dynastic dreams collided with human fragility. This is not simply the story of one forgotten queen. It is a reflection of how empires consumed the lives of women, how duty was forced upon innocence, and how political power demanded human sacrifice. Anna's voice was silenced centuries ago, but her story still echoes, challenging us to confront the cruelty behind royal pageantry. Anna was born in 1549, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. To the outside world, it was a moment of celebration, another branch of the Habsburg tree had taken root. To her family, however, she was not so much a daughter as she was a future contract waiting to be signed. From her first breath, her value was calculated in gold, land, and alliances. Her early life in Vienna's Hofburg Palace offered luxury that few could imagine. Marble floors stretched endlessly through ornate corridors, chandeliers glittered with light, and servants rushed to fulfill every command. Yet to Anna, the palace was less a playground than a prison. Her days were dictated by tutors who drilled her in languages, religion, and etiquette. She was forbidden to laugh too freely, forbidden to run in the gardens, forbidden even to speak out of turn. Spontaneity was a crime. Childhood itself was denied. The court reminded her daily, she did not belong to herself. She belonged to Austria, to Spain, to the dynasty that bore her name. If she was allowed to dream, no record remains of what those dreams were. The records we do have show something colder, the lists of dowries, territories, and marriage negotiations in which her name was traded like property. By the mid-16th century, the Habsburgs were the most powerful family in Europe, but their vast empire was also fragile. They fought wars on every frontier, against the Ottomans in the east, Protestants in the north, and the French in the west. The treasury bled money faster than it could be replenished. Soldiers demanded pay, fortresses demanded repair, fleets demanded wood and iron. In this desperate context, a young girl's womb became a financial asset. Anna's marriage could bring the Spanish crown not only gold but also legitimacy, tying the Austrian and Spanish branches of the dynasty even tighter together. A treaty signed through her hand could hold back enemies more effectively than an army. To the men in power, Anna was not a child, she was the empire's collateral. It is easy, centuries later, to read these facts and think of them abstractly, as if they were inevitable. But imagine, for a moment, a girl of 10 or 12, sitting quietly at a desk, reciting prayers while somewhere in a council chamber her uncles debated which middle-aged monarch she should marry. Imagine knowing your body had already been sold to fund wars you had never seen, to solve problems you could never understand. That was Anna's reality. The motto of her family was often quoted, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." The irony was sharp. For Anna, marriage did not bring happiness. It brought shackles. From the age of 13, whispers circulated about her future. Envoys measured her value the way merchants inspected silk, quietly, clinically, without concern for the person beneath. Philip II of Spain, her uncle, had already lost 3 wives, each dead before their time. Yet rather than learn caution, he sought another. His counselors saw Anna as the perfect candidate, young, fertile, obedient, and, most importantly, Habsburg. When the negotiations concluded, Anna was not present. She was not asked for her thoughts, her fears, or her desires. Her fate was sealed on parchment she never touched. The months that followed transformed her final year of childhood into a rehearsal for adult duties. She was dressed in gowns heavy with gold thread, jewels weighing down her thin frame. Tutors replaced her lessons in music and poetry with lessons in wifely obedience and the duties of the marriage bed. Her body, still that of a girl, was prepared for motherhood by rituals and superstitions that blurred faith and fear. In many ways, Anna's story was not unique. Across Europe, young princesses were shipped from one court to another like pieces on a chessboard. Yet Anna's fate would prove particularly brutal, for the system that consumed her was relentless. Behind the grandeur of her future wedding lay a brutal calculation: Spain needed heirs. Philip II, already in his 40s, was desperate for sons who would carry the Habsburg name into the next generation. Anna, barely a teenager, was chosen to provide them. No one asked whether her body could endure it. No one considered whether her spirit could bear it. The only question was, would she produce the heirs the empire required? And so, as her bridal procession was prepared, Anna walked steadily toward a future that was never hers to choose. The music that played at her wedding was not a celebration of love but a requiem for her childhood. The vows she spoke were not promises of partnership but chains of obligation. Anna of Austria's story is not one of personal failure. It is the story of a system that demanded sacrifice, a dynasty that valued survival above humanity, and a young woman caught in its grip. Her journey from Vienna to Spain would soon begin, a journey that symbolized not just the crossing of geography, but the end of innocence. Crowds would cheer for the child bride they believed would strengthen their empire. But none of them could see what awaited her: years of forced pregnancies, crushing isolation, and a death that came far too soon. Her tragedy had already begun, though the world did not yet recognize it. What they saw as triumph was, in truth, the opening act of one of history's most haunting sacrifices. In the gilded corridors of Spain's royal palaces, history remembers the splendor of kings, the glory of battles, and the grandeur of empire. Yet behind that glittering facade lies a story rarely told, a story not of triumph, but of sacrifice. It is the life of Anna of Austria, a young girl born into the mighty Habsburg dynasty, whose destiny was written before she could even speak. At 14, she was crowned a queen, at 15, she bore her first child, and by the age of 30, she was dead. Anna's tragedy was not an accident of fate. It was the inevitable result of a system that treated women as currency, as vessels for alliances, and as expendable instruments of power. She was raised not for herself, but for her dynasty. Every gesture, every prayer, every breath of her short life was carefully orchestrated to serve the ambitions of others. Her childhood was brief, her freedom non-existent, her body transformed into a battlefield where dynastic dreams collided with human fragility. This is not simply the story of one forgotten queen. It is a reflection of how empires consumed the lives of women, how duty was forced upon innocence, and how political power demanded human sacrifice. Anna's voice was silenced centuries ago, but her story still echoes, challenging us to confront the cruelty behind royal pageantry. Anna was born in 1549, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. To the outside world, it was a moment of celebration, another branch of the Habsburg tree had taken root. To her family, however, she was not so much a daughter as she was a future contract waiting to be signed. From her first breath, her value was calculated in gold, land, and alliances. Her early life in Vienna's Hofburg Palace offered luxury that few could imagine. Marble floors stretched endlessly through ornate corridors, chandeliers glittered with light, and servants rushed to fulfill every command. Yet to Anna, the palace was less a playground than a prison. Her days were dictated by tutors who drilled her in languages, religion, and etiquette. She was forbidden to laugh too freely, forbidden to run in the gardens, forbidden even to speak out of turn. Spontaneity was a crime. Childhood itself was denied. The court reminded her daily, she did not belong to herself. She belonged to Austria, to Spain, to the dynasty that bore her name. If she was allowed to dream, no record remains of what those dreams were. The records we do have show something colder, the lists of dowries, territories, and marriage negotiations in which her name was traded like property. By the mid-16th century, the Habsburgs were the most powerful family in Europe, but their vast empire was also fragile. They fought wars on every frontier, against the Ottomans in the east, Protestants in the north, and the French in the west. The treasury bled money faster than it could be replenished. Soldiers demanded pay, fortresses demanded repair, fleets demanded wood and iron. In this desperate context, a young girl's womb became a financial asset. Anna's marriage could bring the Spanish crown not only gold but also legitimacy, tying the Austrian and Spanish branches of the dynasty even tighter together. A treaty signed through her hand could hold back enemies more effectively than an army. To the men in power, Anna was not a child, she was the empire's collateral. It is easy, centuries later, to read these facts and think of them abstractly, as if they were inevitable. But imagine, for a moment, a girl of 10 or 12, sitting quietly at a desk, reciting prayers while somewhere in a council chamber her uncles debated which middle-aged monarch she should marry. Imagine knowing your body had already been sold to fund wars you had never seen, to solve problems you could never understand. That was Anna's reality. The motto of her family was often quoted, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." The irony was sharp. For Anna, marriage did not bring happiness. It brought shackles. From the age of 13, whispers circulated about her future. Envoys measured her value the way merchants inspected silk, quietly, clinically, without concern for the person beneath. Philip II of Spain, her uncle, had already lost 3 wives, each dead before their time. Yet rather than learn caution, he sought another. His counselors saw Anna as the perfect candidate, young, fertile, obedient, and, most importantly, Habsburg. When the negotiations concluded, Anna was not present. She was not asked for her thoughts, her fears, or her desires. Her fate was sealed on parchment she never touched. The months that followed transformed her final year of childhood into a rehearsal for adult duties. She was dressed in gowns heavy with gold thread, jewels weighing down her thin frame. Tutors replaced her lessons in music and poetry with lessons in wifely obedience and the duties of the marriage bed. Her body, still that of a girl, was prepared for motherhood by rituals and superstitions that blurred faith and fear. In many ways, Anna's story was not unique. Across Europe, young princesses were shipped from one court to another like pieces on a chessboard. Yet Anna's fate would prove particularly brutal, for the system that consumed her was relentless. Behind the grandeur of her future wedding lay a brutal calculation: Spain needed heirs. Philip II, already in his 40s, was desperate for sons who would carry the Habsburg name into the next generation. Anna, barely a teenager, was chosen to provide them. No one asked whether her body could endure it. No one considered whether her spirit could bear it. The only question was, would she produce the heirs the empire required? And so, as her bridal procession was prepared, Anna walked steadily toward a future that was never hers to choose. The music that played at her wedding was not a celebration of love but a requiem for her childhood. The vows she spoke were not promises of partnership but chains of obligation. Anna of Austria's story is not one of personal failure. It is the story of a system that demanded sacrifice, a dynasty that valued survival above humanity, and a young woman caught in its grip. Her journey from Vienna to Spain would soon begin, a journey that symbolized not just the crossing of geography, but the end of innocence. Crowds would cheer for the child bride they believed would strengthen their empire. But none of them could see what awaited her: years of forced pregnancies, crushing isolation, and a death that came far too soon. The year was 1562 when whispers began to grow louder within the vaulted halls of Vienna. At barely 13, Anna of Austria was no longer spoken of as a daughter, a niece, or even a child. She was now a solution. Across Europe, Philip II of Spain's advisors were calculating the stability of their empire, measuring allies and enemies, debts and wars. Their eyes turned toward Vienna, where a fragile girl with Habsburg blood could be transformed into the glue that held an empire together. Spain's treasury was exhausted. Gold shipments from the New World vanished into the bottomless pits of war, soldiers in Flanders demanded wages, fortresses on the Mediterranean needed repair against Ottoman incursions, and fleets patrolling the Atlantic consumed endless wood, iron, and manpower. Every diplomat knew, Philip II could not fight on so many fronts without new sources of wealth. And in the cold arithmetic of dynastic politics, Anna was worth her weight in armies. Her dowry promised jewels, bullion, and new trade privileges. More than that, her marriage would tie Spain and Austria closer together, tightening the dynasty's grasp on Christendom. For the men who debated her fate, she was not a girl in a velvet dress, but a contract written in flesh and blood. Inside Vienna's council chambers, men bent over parchment, quills scratching across treaties and ledgers. They discussed the girl as if she were absent, because in truth, she was. Anna sat in her chambers, reciting prayers, while across the palace, her future was sealed. There was no invitation for her opinion, no space for her fear. The negotiations did not involve her, because she was not considered a participant. She was the prize. Philip II of Spain, her uncle, had already been widowed 3 times. His previous wives, Maria of Portugal, Mary Tudor of England, Elizabeth of Valois, all died young, worn down by the relentless demand for heirs. Each had entered the Spanish court with hope, each had left it as a corpse. Yet instead of seeing this as a warning, Europe regarded it as an inconvenience. A king needed a wife, an empire needed sons, and so another young woman would be offered. This time, it would be Anna. For the courtiers, her youth was not a concern, it was an advantage. At 14, she was pliable, unformed, unlikely to resist. To them, she was a vessel waiting to be filled, a body strong enough to bear children, but too young to question. The cold logic of dynastic survival erased the human truth: she was still a child. Physicians were summoned to examine her body. Their methods were crude, their understanding medieval. They measured her hips, inspected her teeth, calculated her cycles, and whispered to one another with clinical detachment. To them, Anna's worth was in the shape of her bones and the regularity of her blood. They spoke of her womb as though it were already a battlefield, a chamber in which the destiny of Europe would be fought. The verdict was favorable. She was declared fit. Fit to marry. Fit to conceive. Fit to become the 4th wife of a man nearly 3 decades older than her. No one asked whether she was fit to live under such weight, whether her spirit could endure what was demanded. Such questions belonged to another world, one that had no place in the politics of kings. When the engagement was announced, Vienna celebrated with processions, bells, and proclamations. To the city, it was triumph, a marriage that would strengthen ties with Spain, the greatest Catholic power in Europe. But to Anna, the celebrations must have sounded hollow. Behind the fanfares, she was being handed from one hand to another like a jewel displayed in a marketplace. Preparations began immediately. Dressmakers labored over silks heavy with gold thread, gowns that emphasized her womanhood more than her girlhood. Tutors shifted her lessons from poetry and music to the intimate protocols of Spanish court life. Older matrons spoke to her in euphemisms, explaining the duties of a wife not in terms of love or companionship, but of obedience and sacrifice. Every conversation reminded her, she was no longer a child. She was an instrument of God's will and her dynasty's survival. The journey to Spain was planned as a triumphal procession, a parade of power across Europe. Cities would line their streets to glimpse her, to cheer not for Anna, but for what she represented. She became a living symbol of Habsburg prestige, an object of display rather than a person. In these moments, her humanity was stripped layer by layer until only the role remained: bride, queen, mother, vessel. And yet, in the quiet moments that history rarely records, there must have been tears. Perhaps late at night, alone in her chamber, Anna allowed herself to weep silently, clutching a rosary not just for faith but for comfort. Perhaps she dreamed of Vienna's gardens, of the laughter she was never allowed, of a life she could not have. These moments did not make it into the official chronicles, but they were as real as the treaties and decrees. As her departure drew closer, the palace became a hive of preparation. Servants packed chests of jewels, relics, and ceremonial robes. Courtiers rehearsed the protocols of her arrival. Every detail was planned, every step choreographed. Anna herself was fitted and refitted, trained and retrained, until she resembled less a girl than a doll, dressed and posed to satisfy others' expectations. The wedding contract was signed with solemn ceremony. Men in fine robes clasped hands, exchanged blessings, and sealed the bargain with wax and ribbons. But the girl at the center of it all was silent. She did not sign. She did not speak. She was merely presented as proof that the agreement was complete. Thus, Anna's fate was sealed. She would leave behind the halls of Vienna and journey toward a foreign land, toward a husband old enough to be her father, toward a future that offered no promise of joy. The empire celebrated, but Anna was already mourning. As she prepared to board the carriages that would carry her to Spain, her childhood ended not with a farewell, but with a transaction. Gold, land, and alliances passed from hand to hand. And at the center of it all, Anna, silent, obedient, resigned, walked into history as both queen and prisoner. The cathedral bells of Segovia rang out in triumph on the spring morning of 1570. Their peals carried across the hills and into the city below, announcing what was heralded as a sacred union between Spain and Austria, between uncle and niece, between power and power. To the thousands who gathered in the square outside, it was a moment of spectacle. To the courtiers within, it was a triumph of diplomacy. But to Anna of Austria, scarcely 14 years old, it was a funeral for the last fragments of her childhood. The wedding ceremony was staged as a grand performance, designed to awe the world. The cathedral had been draped in silks and hung with golden tapestries embroidered with scenes of saints and martyrs. Candles blazed in their hundreds, filling the air with a heavy, suffocating scent of wax and incense. The nobility of Europe packed the pews, their robes flashing with jewels, while foreign ambassadors leaned forward, eager to carry news of the ceremony back to their monarchs. At the center of it all stood Anna, a small, fragile figure beneath a gown of white silk threaded with gold. The dress had been designed not to comfort but to impress, its bodice stiff with embroidery, its skirt heavy enough that 2 attendants had to lift it as she walked. Around her neck glittered pearls that once belonged to queens now buried, reminders of the lineage she was expected to continue. Her face, pale and composed, betrayed no tears. Years of training had taught her to keep her emotions hidden, but beneath the mask, her heart beat with fear. Opposite her stood Philip II, 42 years old, stern and commanding in his black velvet doublet, the crimson of his sash the only flash of color. His gaze was steady, his movements precise, every inch the monarch who believed himself chosen by God to rule Christendom. When he extended his hand, Anna placed her own into it, not out of affection, but because duty demanded it. The vows were spoken in solemn Latin, echoing through the cathedral's vaulted ceilings. The priest reminded Anna of her obedience, her duty to bear children, her responsibility to God and husband. The words were ritual, but to Anna, they sounded like chains clinking into place. She whispered her responses, her voice almost lost in the cavernous hall, yet clear enough to seal her fate. With each phrase, the empire celebrated, but a girl's freedom died quietly. The feast that followed lasted for 3 days and nights, a display of excess designed to impress. Courtiers consumed roasted peacocks adorned with gilded feathers, exotic spices brought from Asia, and sweet wines shipped across the Atlantic. Theatrical performances filled the palace halls, actors playing out mythological tales of fertility, dynasties, and gods who demanded sacrifice. Every detail was chosen to glorify the marriage, to assure Europe that Spain's dynasty was strong and blessed. But at the high table, Anna sat rigid in her heavy gown, unable to eat more than a few bites. The corseting that emphasized her young figure left her breathless, and nerves made every swallow difficult. Servants hovered at her side, but none asked if she was well. Their task was not to care for her comfort but to maintain appearances. If she smiled faintly, it was because she knew eyes from every corner of Europe were upon her. When the feast ended, the true ordeal began. For while the world celebrated, Anna was led to the bridal chamber, where her private life was no longer her own. Royal custom demanded that the consummation of the marriage be witnessed and reported. Courtiers and officials waited beyond the doors, eager to record whether the king and his new bride had fulfilled their dynastic duty. Privacy, in such a life, did not exist. Philip approached the marriage bed with the same methodical care he applied to his empire. He was not a man of passion but of calculation, a ruler who saw in his niece not a partner but a means to secure heirs. He noted her youth, her innocence, her trembling hands, yet pressed forward with the cold determination of a man convinced he was fulfilling divine and dynastic will. For Anna, the night marked the beginning of a new captivity, one not of gilded palaces but of her own body. In the days that followed, every aspect of Anna's life was scrutinized. Courtiers observed her meals, noting what she ate and when. Physicians hovered constantly, recording her symptoms, her moods, and, most obsessively, her cycles. Every moment of her existence was transformed into data for the court to interpret. Was she fertile? Was she carrying an heir? Could Spain's future be secured through her? Even simple tasks became performances. Morning prayers were recited before audiences of priests, meals were taken with dozens of courtiers watching, even her moments of rest were reported by ladies-in-waiting whose loyalty was to the crown, not to her. To be queen was to be caged in constant surveillance. Anna quickly learned that she could no longer claim a single thought or movement as her own. The Spanish court was notorious for its rigidity, a world of endless ceremony and suffocating protocol. Unlike Vienna, where she had at least known the familiar rhythms of her family's palace, Madrid demanded a stricter obedience. Every greeting, every gesture, every step down a corridor was bound by rules centuries old. Mistakes were not forgiven. Anna's Austrian customs, her accents, her mannerisms, were eyed with suspicion, as though they might conceal heresy or disloyalty. Compounding her fear was the shadow of the Inquisition. Its spies crept even through the royal palace, listening for whispers, ready to accuse anyone of heresy. Anna's longing for home, her letters to Vienna, even her private prayers could be twisted into evidence. She was a queen, yet she lived in terror that a sigh or a misstep might doom her. To the outside world, her marriage was a success. Crowds in Spain cheered their new queen, marveling at her youth and beauty. Painters immortalized her in portraits, her face framed by pearls, her figure draped in silks. Chroniclers wrote of her piety, her obedience, her promise as the mother of heirs. Yet these images were illusions, carefully crafted to hide the truth, a girl torn from childhood, a bride forced into motherhood, a queen trapped in a palace of shadows. Each night, as the candles dimmed and the palace grew quiet, Anna must have lain awake in her chamber, her heart heavy, her body trembling under the weight of expectation. Outside her windows, the empire stretched vast and proud, its ships sailing across oceans, its soldiers marching across borders. But inside her soul, there was only silence, a silence too young, too fragile, and already burdened beyond endurance. The wedding of Anna of Austria was celebrated as a victory for dynasty and faith. But in reality, it was the opening act of a slow tragedy. For while the empire gained a queen, Anna lost everything else, her childhood, her freedom, her body, and soon, even her life. The bells of Segovia had barely faded when Anna of Austria's new life began. For the world, the wedding had been a triumph of dynastic splendor, a bond sealed between Spain and Austria. But for Anna, 14 years old, the ceremony was only the beginning of a much darker ordeal. What awaited her behind the closed doors of the palace was not the life of a queen, but the existence of a prisoner, one whose every movement, every sigh, every glance would be catalogued, studied, and judged. The Spanish court was unlike anything Anna had known in Vienna. In Austria, though her childhood had been tightly managed, there were still moments when she could look out over the gardens, hear music drifting from distant chambers, or steal a few minutes of freedom with her lute. Spain was different. Madrid's court was famed throughout Europe for its rigidity, a labyrinth of protocols so strict that spontaneity was all but criminal. Every gesture had a rule, every word a precedent. Here, the queen did not belong to herself, she belonged to the state, to the dynasty, to God. Each morning began at dawn. Anna was escorted to her prayers by a line of ladies-in-waiting who never left her side. They reported not only whether she prayed but how fervently, how long she knelt, whether her lips moved with proper devotion. Her meals were taken in formal silence, under the eyes of courtiers who noted what she ate, how much, and whether her appetite might indicate pregnancy. Even her expressions were studied. A faint smile, a flicker of fatigue, a sigh too deep, everything was interpreted, recorded, and sometimes reported directly to Philip himself. The king treated his new wife as he treated his empire, with cold calculation. He observed her like an overseer, keeping careful track of her health, her cycles, her moods. He was convinced that God's will and Spain's destiny rested on her ability to bear sons. He was not cruel in the sense of rage or violence, his cruelty was colder, quieter. He regarded her less as a partner than as a vessel, a field in which dynastic seeds must be planted. For Anna, the lack of privacy was suffocating. Her chamber was always full, maids arranging her dress, attendants brushing her hair, chaplains hovering nearby. Even in the most intimate spaces, there was no escape. Letters she wrote to her family were intercepted, read, and sometimes withheld if their contents were deemed inappropriate. Her Austrian customs, her accent, even her private prayers were scrutinized for signs of heresy or disloyalty. She quickly learned that she was never alone, even when no one spoke. The presence of the Inquisition deepened her fear. Its shadow extended into every corridor of the palace. Spies whispered, priests listened, and a misplaced word could destroy reputations or even lives. Anna, with her foreign upbringing, feared that any expression of homesickness might be interpreted as rebellion. If she wept for Vienna, if she longed for the gardens of her childhood, she dared not admit it. Every glance over her shoulder was a reminder that unseen eyes watched, ready to report. Despite the suffocating control, the court demanded constant displays of fertility. Physicians, summoned almost daily, examined her with crude methods, prodding and questioning, their notes cold and detached. They charted her body as if it were a ledger of empire, listing symptoms, calculating the likelihood of conception, debating whether she was strong enough for motherhood. These men were not evil, they were products of a world that believed a woman's body existed only to reproduce. But to Anna, their presence was an invasion. Her body was no longer hers, it was property of the dynasty. Within months, their expectations were fulfilled. At 15, Anna conceived her first child. The announcement was greeted with jubilation across Spain. Bells rang, priests declared blessings, courtiers rejoiced. The empire exhaled in relief, the young queen was fertile, the line secured. But while Spain celebrated, Anna entered a nightmare. Pregnancy in the 16th century was always perilous, but for someone so young, it was torture. Her body had not yet finished maturing, yet it was forced to bear the weight of new life. She suffered morning sickness so violent she could barely rise from bed, swelling in her limbs that made walking painful, fatigue that left her fainting during ceremonies. Instead of sympathy, she was given remedies that did more harm than good. Physicians prescribed bloodletting to balance her humors, purges to cleanse her body, and hot irons pressed to her abdomen to strengthen the womb. Each treatment left her weaker, yet they were praised as signs of devotion to both God and science. Court ritual made her suffering worse. Even while ill, she was expected to attend long masses, to kneel for hours during prayers, to participate in elaborate religious processions. Her pain was treated not as a warning but as a test of her soul. Priests reminded her that women's suffering in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin, that her agony was holy, that her endurance purified the realm. For Anna, this transformed her torment into guilt. If she complained, she was weak in faith. If she faltered, she failed both God and husband. Isolated in her chambers, Anna longed for comfort, but those around her were loyal not to her but to Philip and the dynasty. Older women who attended her offered advice in whispers, urging her to endure, warning her that her every action would be remembered. Letters she tried to send home were read and sometimes censored, denying her even the solace of family. She was alone in every sense but the physical, surrounded by people, yet with no one to confide in. As her pregnancy advanced, the rituals surrounding her body grew stranger. She was made to wear amulets to ward off evil spirits, to avoid foods that might cause deformities, to submit to rituals calculated by court astrologers. Even her sleep was dictated, she must lie on one side, at one hour, in one chamber chosen for its auspicious alignment with the stars. She was treated less as a woman and more as a vessel haunted by superstition, her humanity erased beneath layers of ritual. When labor came, it was agony beyond description. For days she struggled, her small body unable to bear the strain. Physicians hovered, using brutal techniques to force delivery, their ignorance inflicting further injury. At last, a child was born, a son, the empire's long-awaited heir. But the joy was fleeting. The infant was stillborn. The cries that echoed in the chamber were not of new life, but of despair. The blame did not fall on the physicians or the system that forced a girl into motherhood too soon. It fell on Anna. Courtiers whispered that she had been careless, that her prayers were insufficient, that her body was too frail, her mind too weak. Instead of compassion, she received reproach. The empire had demanded a son, and she had failed to deliver. Her recovery was slow and agonizing. Her body, torn and bloodied, struggled to heal. Yet before her wounds closed, pressure mounted again. She had proven she could conceive, and now she must try again. There would be no rest, no reprieve, only another cycle of expectation and suffering. For Anna, the pattern was set. Her marriage was not a partnership but a relentless cycle of pregnancy, loss, and renewed demand. Her body was a battlefield, her soul a captive. Spain gained a queen, but Anna had lost everything else. And this was only the beginning. The death of Anna's first child might have shaken another husband into caution, but for Philip II and his court, it was merely the beginning. The stillbirth was not seen as a warning of what had been demanded from a body too young, but as a failed attempt in a process expected to be repeated until it succeeded. For Anna, just 15, it was the first step into a decade of torment that would grind her health and spirit to nothing. No sooner had her body begun to heal from the tearing pain of childbirth than the pressure returned. Courtiers whispered that she must try again quickly, before the chance of conception slipped away. Physicians declared her fertile, capable, even destined for motherhood. Priests reminded her that suffering was holy, that each loss was part of God's test. And Philip, silent but resolute, watched her closely, keeping meticulous notes of her cycles, her symptoms, her failures. So Anna conceived again. And again. Each time, the bells of Madrid rang in celebration, each time the court rejoiced at the promise of an heir. And each time, the result was heartbreak. Miscarriages in the second or third month, stillborn infants, or babies who lived only a handful of days. The pattern repeated so often that foreign ambassadors wrote of it in their reports, treating her body as a matter of international politics. France whispered that God disapproved of the Habsburg line. England noted opportunities in Spain's instability. Even the Ottoman court watched with interest, sensing weakness. But inside the palace, the blame fell on Anna. Never on the physicians whose brutal remedies worsened her condition. Never on the priests who demanded endless ritual over rest. Never on the king who demanded heirs from a girl not built to endure them. Always on Anna, her prayers not fervent enough, her diet too indulgent, her mind too fragile. And because she had been raised to believe her value lay in obedience, Anna absorbed the guilt. Each loss etched deeper into her spirit, convincing her that she alone had failed Spain, her dynasty, her God. The treatments grew harsher as desperation deepened. Bleeding became routine, weakening her further. Strange concoctions of herbs imported from the Americas were forced upon her, some making her violently ill. Hot poultices and iron instruments were applied to her stomach, leaving her scarred. At times she was forbidden to eat certain foods, forced instead to swallow bitter tonics that sapped her strength. Rather than heal her, medicine became another weapon against her. Her chamber turned into a place of surveillance and superstition. She was rarely left alone, always surrounded by attendants who measured her steps, her appetite, her moods. Books were censored, letters read before being delivered, confessions chosen by Philip himself. Anna's world shrank until it was no larger than her bed and her womb. She became less a queen than a vessel, less a woman than an experiment in reproduction. The psychological toll was immense. Isolated and silenced, Anna turned inward. She wrote letters to her family in Austria filled with longing for home, recalling the change of seasons in Vienna, the gardens of Hofburg, the simple kindness of her parents. These letters, some preserved, read like cries for help. She missed the life she had never been allowed to live, and she feared she would not survive the one imposed on her. Yet amid the despair, she did experience fleeting moments of joy, when her children lived beyond birth. She bore several who survived infancy, though even then, her joy was incomplete. Court protocol demanded that royal children be raised not by their mothers but by wet nurses, tutors, and priests. Anna was allowed brief moments with them, kisses stolen before they were carried away, lullabies whispered only when attendance permitted. She could love them, but not raise them. She could bear them, but not protect them. Even motherhood, the role forced upon her, was denied in its truest form. Her surviving son, the future Philip III, was removed from her care as soon as he could walk. Anna was told that a mother's influence might soften a boy, make him unfit for kingship. The irony was cruel, she was forced to endure the agony of bearing him, yet unworthy to guide him. The separation cut deeply, leaving her both proud and hollow. The losses piled higher with each year. More miscarriages. More stillbirths. More infant graves in the royal crypt. Each child buried was a wound that never healed, yet Philip's pressure never lessened. To him, and to the court, each failure was a reason to try again, to gamble once more with her life. The cycle destroyed her body. Servants whispered about her fainting spells, her inability to keep food down, her gaunt figure, her brittle hair. Portraits from this period show a woman far older than her years, her eyes hollow, her posture stooped, her face drawn with exhaustion. She was not yet 30, yet she carried the weight of decades. Still, the court demanded appearances. Even when weak, she was forced to attend masses, to kneel for hours, to walk in processions that left her trembling. Her suffering was framed as sanctity, priests declared her pain was purifying her soul, preparing her for heavenly reward. To question it would be to question God. And so Anna endured, trapped in a cycle that sanctified her destruction. Beyond the palace walls, her tragedy reverberated across Europe. Ambassadors wrote of Spain's uncertainty, kings and queens speculated about succession, and rivals sharpened their ambitions. A young woman's failing health became fuel for international intrigue. Her body was not only her prison, it was the battlefield of an empire. By the late 1570s, Anna's health had deteriorated visibly. Chronic anemia, malnutrition, and what today would be recognized as postpartum depression plagued her. She was weak, frail, often bedridden. Yet when she conceived again, the court celebrated as though it were a blessing, blind to the fact that it was a death sentence. The endless cycle of pregnancy, loss, and blame had reduced her to a shadow of the girl who once played music in the Hofburg. Her voice, once soft but alive, now barely whispered. Her body, once fragile but youthful, now broken. And yet the demands continued, relentless, merciless, as if she were not a queen but a sacrificial offering to the empire. Her story in those years was not one of individual choice but of systemic cruelty. The dynasty demanded heirs. The court demanded fertility. The church demanded suffering. And Anna, trapped at the center, gave everything she had until there was nothing left to give. By the year 1579, Anna of Austria had endured nearly a decade of relentless pregnancies. Her body was worn thin, her spirit hollowed by repeated loss, and yet the Spanish court celebrated when she conceived once more. To them, this was proof of her continued usefulness. To Anna, though, it felt like a summons to death. She was not yet 30, but her body was already failing. Her skin had grown pale and sickly, her hair brittle, her figure frail. Servants whispered of her fainting spells, her inability to eat, her constant exhaustion. Still, physicians and priests told her that bearing another child was her sacred duty. This pregnancy was different from the start. The swelling in her body came early, accompanied by searing headaches and waves of dizziness. What modern medicine would recognize as dangerous complications, hypertension, edema, were interpreted by her doctors as imbalances of humors. Their treatments were as brutal as ever, repeated bloodletting that drained what little strength she had left, bitter herbal concoctions forced upon her, poultices applied to her abdomen in hopes of strengthening her womb. Instead of relief, they inflicted torment. As the months dragged on, Anna grew weaker. She could scarcely walk the length of her chamber without clutching the wall for support. Even sitting upright became a struggle. Yet she was expected to attend Mass, to kneel for long prayers, to endure hours of public ceremony. The chaplains reminded her that her suffering was divine, that her agony was sanctification. She was taught to believe that each contraction, each drop of blood, each sleepless night was a holy offering to God. To complain was to sin. Her attendants saw the truth more clearly. In private letters, some of the older midwives expressed horror at the state of the queen, confessing that they feared she would not survive another birth. They knew her body had been pushed beyond its limit, but their voices carried no weight. Male physicians dismissed them as emotional women, while Philip himself insisted the risk was necessary. A dynasty could not rest on a single fragile heir. As the due date approached in October 1580, the palace clung to hope and fear in equal measure. Special masses were held daily for the queen's health. Relics were brought from across the empire, pressed to her body in hopes of miraculous intervention. Courtiers whispered prayers in chapel after chapel, but beneath their piety was calculation. If Anna died, what then? Who would Philip marry next? How would succession be secured? Even before the birth, her death was being weighed against political necessity. Labor began on a grey autumn day. From the first hour, it was clear the ordeal would be worse than any she had endured before. The contractions tore through her body, leaving her gasping and delirious. For days she remained in agony, her cries echoing through the palace corridors. Physicians hovered, applying leeches, bleeding her further, fumbling with instruments they scarcely understood. Midwives tried to comfort her, but their advice was dismissed by the men in charge. Her bed was surrounded not by compassion but by rituals, holy water sprinkled on her sheets, relics pressed against her chest, priests murmuring prayers while her body collapsed. After days of torment, a child was delivered, a daughter, small but alive. For a brief moment, the court rejoiced. The dynasty had another child, another hope, another symbol. But for Anna, the battle was not over. The bleeding began almost immediately, a hemorrhage that the physicians could not stop. They stitched clumsily with silk, pressed herbs into her wounds, but their ignorance only deepened the crisis. Fever set in, her breath grew ragged, her eyes dimmed. Within days, infection consumed her. On October 26, 1580, Anna of Austria died. She was 30 years old. The official report spoke of complications of childbirth, but the truth was far harsher. Anna had been used to death, her body sacrificed, her youth consumed, her life extinguished by a system that valued her only for the children she could bear. Philip II, so cold throughout their marriage, was said to be devastated by her death. Some chroniclers claimed he wept, others that he fell into a depression from which he never recovered. He never married again. Yet whether his grief came from love or guilt, no one could say. What is certain is that he lived on for 18 more years, ruling an empire that had cost him his wife's life. The aftermath revealed the true cruelty of the court. Within hours of her death, courtiers discussed succession, future marriages, and the political consequences of losing their queen. Her body, still warm, was prepared for burial with the same pomp that had marked her wedding. Draped in silks, crowned with jewels, she was laid in state as though she had been honored in life, though in truth she had been consumed. Her funeral was magnificent. Thousands attended, candles filled the cathedral, eulogies praised her obedience, her fertility, her willingness to die for her dynasty. Not a word was spoken of the girl she had once been, the child who had played music in Vienna, who had written poetry, who had longed for freedom. History remembered her not as a woman but as a sacrifice. Her children carried her tragedy forward. Philip III, her only son to survive, grew into a weak and indecisive ruler, perhaps scarred by the absence of his mother. Her daughters were married off as pawns in new alliances, replicating the same suffering that had killed her. None lived long, and several died young, repeating the cycle that Anna herself had endured. Her story slipped into the shadows of history. While Philip II was remembered as one of Spain's greatest monarchs, Anna became little more than a footnote, her suffering dismissed as an inevitable cost of dynastic politics. For centuries, her name lay forgotten, buried beneath the splendor of empire and the rhetoric of faith. Yet her life holds meaning still. In every faint portrait of her weary face, in every surviving letter where she longed for home, we glimpse the truth of a young woman stripped of her humanity. She was not a queen in her own right, but a vessel, consumed until there was nothing left. And in that, she stands as a symbol, not of triumph, but of the violence hidden behind crowns and thrones. The tragedy of Anna of Austria was not unique. Across Europe, royal women endured the same fate, married young, forced into pregnancies that destroyed them, silenced by churches that sanctified their suffering, forgotten by histories that glorified the men they served. But Anna's life, preserved in fragments, forces us to remember the human cost of empire. Her 30 years were filled not with freedom but with duty, not with joy but with sacrifice. She was born into privilege but lived in a prison. And when she died, she left behind not only children but a haunting question: how many lives have been broken, how many voices silenced, for the sake of political ambition? Anna of Austria did not choose her fate. But in remembering her, we choose not to let her suffering vanish into silence. She remains, across the centuries, a fragile yet enduring voice calling from behind the gilded walls of empire, a reminder that beneath every crown lies a story of blood, and beneath every throne, the bones of those who paid its price.